Currently, the LCS is a slowly sinking ship, from multiple esports orgs going under, such as TSM putting out a budget roster and also looking to sell their LCS spot so they can move to another major region, some guessing it's the LPL, CLG selling their spot to NRG, and Evil Geniuses losing a lot of their sponsors. LCS teams are hurting right now. That's why the LCS teams have asked Riot to get rid of the requirement for them to field an academy team, also known as the NA Challengers League or NACL. Riot obliged and removed the requirement, so 7 out of 10 teams dropped their academy rosters. Now, the LCS Players Association is about to stage a walkout or player strike, according to esports journalist Mikhail Klimentov. I'm going to go over a quick timeline of events for all of this so that you can kind of get the gist of everything. After that, I'll explain why the teams are actually right, because these players don't provide any tangible value to the orgs, and the inflated LCS player salaries is partly why this is happening, but also why the players should actually give a shit about this, because their jobs and futures are on the line. I'll also explain how a walkout or strike helps the players, and for all the industry folk listening, I think this will be a good general explainer for you as well. It all starts out with a Pokemon leaking that the LCS orgs voted to remove the NACL team requirement starting for summer 2023. Look guys, ESPN esports is dead. We gotta make do with fucking Pokemon reporters. I don't make the rules. After Riot removed the requirements for teams to field an NACL roster, the LCSPA released a statement saying Riot went behind their back and did this without consulting the LCSPA, as the requirement was meant to be negotiated after the 2023 summer split for the upcoming 2024 year. What's wild is that the LCS orgs have wanted this to happen for at least 2 years prior to this year, so this sudden release caused the loss of several jobs. As a side note, can I just say, is anyone else surprised that the LCSPA actually has some balls now? So refreshing to see after what seemed like a paper tiger. The LCSPA had a couple of points they were willing to negotiate on with Riot and the orgs in this statement. 1, allowing local wage laws to apply to NACL players, because currently they are requiring California labor law wages, which by law requires teams to pay each player $64,480 or $65K. Allow teams to partner with affiliate organizations, allow in-game item sales that help fund the NACL, and introduce a promotion and relegations and rev sharing for orgs that aren't LCS orgs, so that if you're an amateur team and you're promoted into the NACL, they immediately start getting money and rev share. The LCSPA then iterates that this would reduce current NACL operating costs by about 50% for team organizations. So let's pause here, because I think all of these asks are quite reasonable aside from the in-game sales. We all know Riot has notoriously shut this idea down over and over again throughout the years, even to LCS teams, so why would they support the NACL teams? They just talked about creating a Worlds Pass essentially and monetizing in-game content that will be shared with teams. So that's just a ridiculous ask in a way that is shoving the bill onto Riot instead of the teams. I mean, the skins aren't just free to create. You need a programmer, a designer, etc. But of course, with the new news that we heard that if you subscribe to the NACL channel on Twitch, part of the sub revenue gets put over to the teams themselves, but to ask for in-game content is just a completely different ask. Also in this statement, the LCSPA dropped the bombshell that teams were paid $3 million each from Riot as part of their rev share cut, and I guess part of this was an advance payment according to Monte Cristo on the Four Horsemen podcast. Also, go check that out and listen to Phil Aram talk about this in detail if you want to hear more about that. Now, you may be asking yourself, since teams are required to pay NACL players $65K, is that enough to live in LA? I fucking hate this question because fans that don't know shit about LA or even just money in general keep saying either you can't live in LA with $65,000 or you would be living in some rundown part of the town. This is either literal children making these comments or people from well-to-do families or college graduates. This is not true. So just for reference, I make around $65,000 a year. Not with this YouTube shit or articles, of course, but that's another conversation. I easily afford this beautiful dojo of a studio apartment in Compton. Nah, I'm fucking kidding you. I live in the west side of LA, like 10 or so blocks from the LCS arena, which, by the way, the west side is considered the rich side of Los Angeles because it's closer to the beach. You can actually see the economic disparity through the way traffic flows at rush hour, with fewer cars heading towards the coast and a swarm of cars driving back more inland. Anyways, this is all without a roommate, guys. $65K with a roommate, you'd be fucking making bank. I moved to LA to cover the LCS in 2017 doing player interviews, and I was making like $45,000 when I got here. And now with making around $65,000, I can actually afford different luxuries and things, going out to eat, etc. Live a pretty normal life and have some luxuries. So it is possible to live on $65,000 in LA and still pay for rent as well too, especially if you have a roommate. I'd just like to dispel that rumor. So now that we've got that bullshit narrative out of the way of pros not making enough money to live here and even amateur pros not making enough, let's talk about how the players are correct in this matter. That the LCS teams are spending irresponsibly and the NACL is not to blame. Let's do some quick maths here. Going to be producing a expense report. Now, obviously, these are not what teams are currently paying, nor is it supposed to be representative of actual salaries of the operations, but this is meant to be a rough estimate and bare bones for staffing, operations, but you'll see in a second why, even as a rough estimate, teams are still pissing away a ton of money. We have $390K for 6 NACL players at $65,000, which is the minimum. One player obviously over for the sub category. And then we have $450K for 6 LCS players, one being a sub of course, at $75K, which is the LCS player minimum salary, right? So we have $840K total minimum. Right? Keep that number in mind. I'll keep it on the screen. We have $100K for 2 analysts, that's $50,000 each. $150K for 2 head coaches, that's $75,000 each. $200K for 2 marketers or salespeople, that's $100,000 per person. Here is also a job from Indeed.com for a global account executive from Team Liquid. It's on there right now. We have $120K for house rent, that's $12,000 a month. You think a 3-bedroom costs around $3.5K, and this is actually from real world experience because I know one of the landlords, which one of the teams actually stay in, so I know the actual prices that they're paying. You have $50K for a team manager, $100K for a senior accountant. Here's another Indeed posting for TSM that is trying to look for a senior accountant, $50K for a social media person, and $50K to pay for a lawyer for retainer, as well as pay for any fees that you may need for specific jobs of him writing contracts and things like that throughout the year. So now we have $820K support in total. So combine that with also the player's salary, you're going to come to $1.66 million. That means I still have roughly 1.34 million remaining to spend on taxes, liability insurance, extra player salary, extra stuff and my own salary as well. Now, this also obviously leaves room for any underpaid salaries I mentioned above. I also haven't even included the team sponsorship revenue and then the VC money they could have dipped into as well. So it's completely reasonable from a player perspective to say orgs are spending irresponsibly elsewhere. But wait, there's more. Now the LCSPA has released another statement with a list of demands. Institute Valorant-style promotion and relegation between LCS and NACL. Now, essentially, this would mean reworking franchising and not abolishing it. That's absolutely absurd, and no team would agree to this because it cheapens the franchise slots. Valorant has a system similar to like the CSGO Louvre agreement with ESL, which says partner teams are guaranteed a slot in the tournament, but there are additional slots open for the NACL teams to compete for to join that league. So that means the LCS would probably be 12 teams instead of 10, 2 of which are open for the best NACL teams to promote into. Now, this doesn't seem like a crazy ask at first, but this is essentially the same concept as lowering the real estate value. For instance, certain parts of cities do not allow apartments to be built in that neighborhood, and they also have minimum lot sizes, so you can't divide a piece of land into several buildings. This is true for places like Brentwood or Beverly Hills, for instance. This means rich people essentially keep their real estate at a very high value. You look at countries like Japan, which have very cheap housing value and very cheap land value, and that's because their housing and zoning laws allow for a lot of houses to be built in weird places and industrial places and things like that. That actually doesn't work in America. We have zoning laws for warehouses, we have zoning laws for a shopping center and shopping areas. That's why you don't see those different businesses mixed with houses as well too next to the same properties. The more slots that there are in the league, the cheaper the value of each slot. So obviously the teams are not going to agree to this. Now, the reason why this would be a great thing for the NACL to be able to have promotion slots to the LCS, other than the face value of obviously a path to pro, is it also allows for academy teams to truly showcase their talent. If no one watches academy and all of a sudden these academy teams start promoting or even beating LCS teams, maybe those orgs will start giving buyouts to these NACL teams, and it would sort of be an easier way for them to scout talent, as you would be able to see the players' direct results against LCS teams and actual LCS talent. The second point is Riot commit to a revenue pool for player salaries of $300K per NACL team per year. We can assume this means as part of the revenue split that is given to teams, $300K is required to be separated and spent on just NACL salaries. If we're talking 6 players, that's $50K each instead of the current $65K each. This would also mean that the amateur teams get $300K each as well. This would help incentivize amateur orgs actually wanting to compete. I actually don't think this is that absurd because it's really just requiring teams to spend money for academy budget. This also makes sense for the next ask, since amateur teams would also be getting into this $300K pool as well. And this second ask is allow LCS orgs to partner with affiliates for cost sharing. This one's pretty simple, and basically what it says, you just partner with a third-party organization and they share some of the costs, like maybe housing or food or transportation or PCs or whatnot, and so you can share the burden between an LCS organization and an amateur organization so that it's less burden for the LCS team. Another ask is Riot guarantees LCS minimum contracts for the following year for the 5 players who win the LCS Summer Finals each year. So this sounds confusing at first, as in you mean the LCS teams must keep those 5 players on the roster? No, it just means if all of the LCS orgs choose to not field those 5 players and any of the LCS teams, they must pay $75K out of their rev share to each player that doesn't make it on a team. This would probably rarely ever get invoked, since the likelihood of a LCS winner not getting picked up for spring is mega rare, but also this is still an absurd ask. That's basically an additional severance package that the LCSPA wants for these championship players. Institute a 3 out of 5s roster continuity rule to provide players on released NACL rosters first priority in maintaining their slots in the upcoming NACL season if a majority continue to compete together. So this rule is actually probably the most reasonable. This is similar to CSGO, where a team can't go to a major if they get rid of 3 out of the 5 players from the qualifying roster. This is probably the least absurd ask, as I'm saying, in this list, and I think it makes absolute sense. This should have been a rule to begin with, to be honest. So now that we're all caught up with what's happened, then it comes to, why do LCS players give a shit? How does the NACL help them? And what does a walkout do for them? Players should give a shit because, as the LCSPA is alluding to, this is just a large step and a cascading effect that will keep pushing the players down. Think about it logically. If the NACL is gone, orgs will complain that they can't find new talent. They'll go to Riot Daddy and say, how do you expect us to succeed if we have no talent? Let us remove the import rule. Suddenly, you have all import rosters, and not only would amateur players be screwed, but current LCS players would suffer as well. The NACL has provided a safety net to fall back on if a LCS player can't perform at the professional level. Think about this. If you get benched, you no longer have a contract clause that says you move down to academy. You get paid basically fuck all, aka LCS minimum, to sit on the bench, and you have no way to prove yourself. You're essentially trapped in contract prison without an escape. The whole contract structure for the LCS is basically up in the air now, and all contracts with an NACL clause will definitely need to be restructured in the future, most likely lowering the salaries of the LCS players. How does a walkout help them? First, let's get this out of the way. A walkout is not a breach of contract, but don't take my word for it. Let's listen to Phil Aram from the Four Horsemen podcast.
So walkouts are a federally protected right. We have the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, and the act that accompanies it, and NLRA, and those govern and protect employees in certain circumstances, and they are not exclusive to circumstances where employees are unionized. There are many protected actions for employees in non-union circumstances. Riot should be very familiar with this. They've had plenty of employees walk out recently around sexual misconduct and other things at Riot Games. So they've experienced walkouts. Activision Blizzard had walkouts recently as well. They've been well publicized. These are federally protected actions. If you don't show up to work, they don't have to pay you for the day you didn't show up, but they can't fire you. They can't retaliate against you.
Right.
Those are federal crimes.
So a walkout would mean that you don't get paid for that day. That's it. It's perfectly legal in California, which has some of the most pro-employee laws in the entirety of the United States. The walkout is the only powerful negotiating card the players really have, and anything that can punish both Riot and the team organizations. The LCS product is basically useless without players, will generate negative press for Riot, and doesn't do their game League of Legends any favors to help sell their skins, and it paints Riot in a very bad light. This walkout also obviously screws orgs because they fail to fulfill their sponsorship obligations, and particularly day one of the LCS Summer Split is supposed to be this huge spectacle, right? With a rundown of all these storylines, the content shoots, maybe even an event at the LCS involving fans. You get some of your sponsorship activations done, etc., etc. None of this happens if the players do a walkout, and it taints anything that would be done in the following days or weeks. Well, Doesn't this hurt the players as well? Yes, it does, but it's the lesser of two evils for them because they're afraid of completely being replaced by imports because this leads to the import rule being abolished, and also they have no fallback for jobs with the NACL being gone. Why would the current imports help support the walkout or strike? Really, at this point, there isn't a big reason for an import to support this other than possibly having the chance to fall back on NACL if they get benched, which helps them negotiate contract terms when they first get imported. Without the NACL, the negotiating power for the player is lessened. Also, consider if an import doesn't have the choice of falling down to NACL, that means that they either get traded or they get kicked from the league. This has implications on visas, and if you're an import who might be looking to get a green card or something, or simply just staying in NA, it kind of screws that whole process over. A P1 visa, which is the visa pros use, only lasts 30 days, I believe, after your last day of your contract has been terminated. So, if you aren't picked up by another team in 30 days, you're screwed, and you need to go back to Korea or wherever. So NACL would serve as kind of a decent holding cell as you compete to sell you to another team, or you just compete entirely in the NACL, right? So if that doesn't exist, essentially you're super screwed as an import. Okay, let's talk about the org side of the situation. Why are the LCS orgs correct in abolishing the NACL? First, orgs shouldn't be required to have an amateur team. It should be an option. If orgs want to exercise that, then fine. We already see Team Liquid, FlyQuest, and Evil Geniuses are already doing that. If that's part of their business plan, more power to you, right? But Riot shouldn't have a say in how the org operates their business. Now, esports orgs have been hemorrhaging money for a very long time due to inflated salaries, and everyone cites that this has been starting most recently since about 2017, when Immortals kind of messed everything up with Noah Winston inflating all these salaries because, you know, he wanted to be the new kid on the block and start getting big names and whatnot. So let's go through some of these salaries actually. Perks was signed for $2 million a year in Cloud9 for 2021. Impact signed a deal with Team Liquid in 2017 for $1.13 million a year. Huni signed a deal with Dignitas for 2020 for $1.15 million a year. Alfari for 2021 was signed for more than $1 million a year to Team Liquid. Jensen was signed to Team Liquid for 2021 for $1.4 million a year. I could go on and on and on about the salaries, but you get the point. Player salaries are absolutely insane. Combine that with NACL, which doesn't help the LCS org sell sponsorships whatsoever, doesn't help Riot sell sponsorships whatsoever. It's basically just a huge money pit generating zero revenue. Yes, it may pay dividends in the future, but currently it doesn't. On top of that, it's another negotiating point against teams when trying to haggle player contracts and the bench clauses. Without NACL, we can drive down player salaries in LCS while also just saving on the NACL roster cost itself. So why are you paying these insane salaries? Wouldn't rookies help you save money? In some ways, yes, rookies do help save money, but also they bring fuck all in terms of sponsorship money. If I go to a sponsor and say, this academy player we just promoted has 5K followers on Instagram and Twitter, that's not a good sell to a sponsor. Now, if he's really good, sure, I can recoup that with a better shot at Worlds, but it's less of a guarantee to that sponsor, so they're going to give me less sponsorship dollars right out the gate. It's also a balancing act of getting players that have high social reach and are also good at the game, right? This is how I sell a sponsorship package. A rookie player is essentially useless in my pitch to sponsors, which is where teams generate basically all of their revenue. Now, I'm not going to go into the recent announcement of the NACL that Riot put together because it's basically irrelevant to all of this, and this video is already mega long. So let's get over the final bits here. The players are trying to do a walkout because it has implications on current contracts for LCS pros with a NACL benching clause it shifts more powers to orgs, and it gives more weight for LCS orgs to drop the import rule. The LCS teams have spent recklessly, and it's not because the players or the NACL rosters itself and the salaries. Also, I should mention that a lot of these teams have offices and compounds, such as TSM in this area called Playa Vista. I've actually been around that area, and it's one of the most expensive places in all of LA. There's no reason why TSM needs a facility in one of the richest areas. That's like a business opening up an office on Rodeo Drive and complaining that they can't meet budget. It's like, well, obviously don't open an office in a place you can't afford. The orgs are opposed to the NACL because it will help them negotiate against LCS player contracts with an NACL clause. They shouldn't be required to do an amateur team at all. It should be a choice, and rookies affect their sponsorship package deals, and currently it's just not worth the savings they get from their contract when they can just go get a higher skilled rookie from abroad, from the LCK for instance. Also, notice that the team orgs haven't said a whole lot about these aspects because it's more specific, alludes to selling false sponsorship packages anyways with their viewership metrics, and also they would never win a public war with players as the players have all the popularity. So all in all, this situation has way more implications than I've heard anyone else break down, from podcasts to articles to players and teams themselves, primarily because they want to make themselves look good and aren't telling the full details and logic behind any of this. So now that I've explained everything about the walkout, the players' arguments, and the org arguments, this is a very important battle for both sides, and there's a lot at stake here, and there's a lot at stake just for the entire esports industry. Thanks for watching. Peace.